Good morning, dear friends and let's say followers. This is another lecture in philosophy education, and as usual, I'll depart from one book that I found to be interesting, and I will try to explain its structure and the argument that it presents. The book that I'm talking about today is Towards an Ontology of Teaching, Think-Centered Pedagogy, Affirmation and Love for the World by Vlieghe and Zamojski. So, as usual, without much ado, I want to get directly to the content of the book, and today I'm focusing more on the introduction of the book, and I think it's a good place to start, especially that it summarizes really the argument of the book in a good way. Now, I read the book many times. I can confirm that really everything is here in the introduction. So I will try really to go through the detail of this introduction, which is also the first chapter of the book. If I have time, I will also in the next days go through each of these chapters and try to present the argument with details. This book, which is quite famous now, starts by situating itself vis-a-vis the critical theory. Let's say that it is a bit heretical and also, let's say, critical of critical pedagogy, but in a very specific way. It is not anti-critic, but it is post-critic. What is post-critic? Post-critic means that this attempt to find new forms of reading and interpreting the world, and for example, schools, in a way that goes beyond the methods of critique and critical theory, ideological criticism, and instead the researchers would try to have an affirmative attitude to the world and to their subjects of study. Now, why the book positions itself as post-critical, it is because it departs from one of the limits of critical theory, which is that critical theory denies the existence of any essence of education beyond its political function. We always think, when we are, let's say, critical theorists of the school, as something that is political, and we can't imagine any essence of schools or teachers or students without thinking also of that in terms of political functions and so on. And from this very specific limit, this book will try to build its arguments, and each chapter it basically raises one of its skepticisms towards critical theory and tries to give something that it deems is better, let's say, and it's more affirmative, and I would even say more useful for teachers. Okay, so by post-critique, what the authors want is a positive language, similar to what they did in the very famous publication, which is the Manifesto for Post-Critical Pedagogy, which is written by the same authors of this book, Vlieghe and Zamojski, but also by Naomi Hodgson, who I think works in Liverpool. And they published this manifesto in 2017, and in 2018 we had this book, which is the Ontology of Teaching. The book is more focused on the job of teaching, and it tries to get beyond, as I said, the critical theory, and wants to produce a vision of teaching as not like implicated in the reproduction of inequalities, of pressure, and let's say the distance between teachers and students, these hierarchies and so on, talking, for example, about social class, gender, and so on. They really don't want to deal with that. They think that being a teacher is not really about that, but it's about something different, which the book will talk about today. And their question is, what makes a teacher, despite all these criticisms, despite all these power relations in which teaching may be implicated? And here, of course, I think, and I think we are all right to think a bit that there is a kind of naivety here, and think that trying to think beyond critique may be actually political itself. I mean, I'm mainly showing the argument of the authors. For the authors, they say that we are aware of that, and what we want to do here is to think and consider teaching beyond any political entanglements. What they want to do more precisely is that they want to bring to light some positive aspects of teaching that have been forgotten because, according to the authors, the prominence of critical theory has made us accustomed to think about teaching only in negative words. That is, critical theory is mainly about negation. And instead, teaching is more about affirmative attitude, but because of critical theory and its dominance in talking about teaching, we forgot to talk about this affirmative and it's a positive. One would say a positive way of thinking. I don't know. Here, of course, as you can see, as you can understand, there's already this bold claim about being critical to critical theory, but then there is something even more which the authors bring, right, like I think on the 4th page of the book or so. And they say that that critical theory enters in an infinite spiral where it tries endlessly to debunk power relations and the evils in the world and bring something new. But right when it brings something new, it again thinks, well, there's maybe something political here, so we need again to negate it and bring something else. And for the authors, it is impossible to combine a language of affirmation, which is the one of teachers, the one of love for the world, with the one of critical pedagogy. And for them, critical theory is basically its ontology, its condition is to be political. And for the authors, to be political means that you have a hate for the world. You want to change it. It's not something that you want to preserve. Okay? For the authors, teaching up is about something different, which is staying true to the love that one has for a particular subject matter. Let's say teaching something like mathematics, geography, astrology, and so on. And it's about this relentless effort to bring this love all the time to the public and to pass it to a new generation. And this new generation of newborn, of children, they can themselves start the world in a new way. Okay, they can take the word from you and then they start it in their way. So here there isn't really much work of critique or negation, but there's more about being positive to the world. And for the authors, it's this love for the world that defines a teacher. That's what makes a teacher a teacher. Now, by this, I'm sure that the argument is already too much bold, but then the authors would even take it to the extreme. And they would say that one of the consequences of critical pedagogy is that we undermine the importance of teaching. How is that? They go basically to the work of Biesta, who is famous, and he also published in 2017 a book about the job of teaching, trying to have also an affirmative language. And there he also kind of attacks critical pedagogy. I don't want to say the word attack, but it's almost that's what he does. And for him, he starts by saying that basically critical pedagogy starts from a discussion of two modes of teaching. It's the backdrop of these two models of teaching. Of course, the two models of teaching are the two most famous ones. You have the traditional and let's say outdated transmittive model where the teacher is at the center. And in this model, there is basically no learning if there isn't a teacher. There is no learning without teaching. And the second model is the progressive one. It's more fashionable today and has been fashionable for the last, I don't know, maybe 80 years. And it's centered on the student and learning. And in this approach, there should be no authority. And it's not really about the teacher, it's about the students. And I don't know, as one would say that good teaching is teacher light. So we try really to put most of the work at the hands of the students. What does critical pedagogy think of this? about both arguments. It actually criticizes both models of teaching. So for the first one, it says that by having this authority from the teacher to the student, what we do is that we teach students to be accepting, to be willing to accept this authority from, let's say, higher authority, for example, of the teacher. And this criticizes the second model because when you take learning and you give it only to students without teachers, what happens is that you also kind of generalize this to be a social and political model. So what happens is that each problem is treated as a problem of learning. Like you have problem of unemployment, no, okay, let's teach people to have new skills. You have, I don't know, for example, with the financial crisis of 2008, instead of just rethinking the whole neoliberal model, what we do is that, well, we teach people how to be resilient in such an economic model. So when we give less importance to teaching, what happens is that we give more importance to learning, and then this learning itself becomes a social, let's say, a political strategy, what Biesta calls learnification of social problems. Okay, now the solution for critical pedagogy of both problems is that we should do more critique, so become more critical of both traditional and also these progressive ways of teaching, because both of them, they serve the status quo. And what we need to do, as I said, is to show that teaching actually has a political function. And then students should learn to become more engaged, critically autonomous, and to be also community-oriented citizens, and so on, like to have a good democratic system. The authors of this book on Ontology of Teaching, Piotr Zamojski and Joris Vlieghe, they think that, like, of course, from their post-critical attitude, they think that this, like all of this, actually what it does is that it marginalizes the role of teaching, and teaching becomes, for example, in progressive pedagogy, something more about dialogical, student-led and problem-based learning. So in such model, the best thing to do is really to avoid any prominence of the teacher. So we kind of negate the role of teachers. And that's a problem in critical pedagogies when they try to have such an emancipatory way of teaching, is that they really try all the time to get rid of the teacher. For the authors, what they want to do is that, okay, first of all, they admit that learning can take also place without teaching. Secondly, they also admit that there is a political meaning to what happens at school. And then third, that we should be, of course, opposed to all forms of reproduction and the production, of course, of social injustices and so on. But even with all of this, what they want to do is that they want teaching, they want to stay true. They want teachers not to be political actors, but to stay only true to their love to what they teach, to have this intrinsic value of teaching. And this value is an affirmative one of the word. And this book basically tries to develop and to speak about teaching in this sense. Okay, so again, the title of the book is Towards an Ontology of Teaching, Teaching-Centered Pedagogy, Affirmation and Love for the Word. But then the question is, what is ontology? And they know that even people who study philosophy, maybe they don't really have a precise definition. I think that's part of what ontology is. Now, let's just take a very simple definition and say that it is this discipline of philosophy that tries to give those general features of reality and tries to examine what is shared in the characteristics of the beings, and then have, let's say, classification of beings and so on, like basic types. What makes, for example, something what it is really, and that's, for example, the case of teaching. So what is the ontology of teaching? What makes teaching? For the authors, what makes teaching is a practice that is meaningful in and of itself, despite all the inevitable entanglements with political processes. And again, what we need to ask here is, what is the status of ontology here? What does it mean? For the authors, having a definition of teaching is not about saying what makes a good teacher and so on, but it is more about looking at the experiences of teachers, so people who are really teaching. So this becomes more, this moves from being an ontology to being a phenomenology, and that's really something that is, it's explicit in the book. The authors talk about it. And the reference to have such a meaning of the ontology of teaching from the experiences, the phenomenological experiences of the teachers, is something that they get from Frieser. Norm Frieser, that phenomenology should be about the exercise of rendering explicit the activities of our experiences, and that make a difference, and that we find hard to express. Now, I know this is hard maybe to understand, but let's take in the case of teaching, what would it be? Klaus Melonhauer, who is one of the main references in this book and is famous for his pedagogical hermeneutics, for him, it's not just because we have different experiences of teaching that we should not believe that there is a common understanding of teaching. On the contrary, for him, we should trust our capacity to reach a common understanding of teaching. Another good reference also here, and I think the authors wouldn't find a better reference, is of course the founder of the modern pedagogy, who is Johann Friedrich Herbart. And Herbart thinks that the role of education philosophy and theory is to disclose what we do and how we comport ourselves when we educate. With this tradition, teaching becomes itself about this act of showing, in German, zeigen. And in one of the chapters, the authors would really get into the details. So teaching is about rendering explicit and articulating in concept the understanding of education we always put in practice, even in an implicit way. That's for them. That's the way that they want to understand teaching. And this understanding of teaching also, as you will see in minutes, I think at least in 2 other chapters, is based also on the idea of Martin Heidegger and this distinction between the ontic and the ontological. The ontic, as you know, refers to those individual changes and characteristics of the experience of teaching. So in this case, so it is what is different in our experiences of teaching. And the ontological is about those the fundamental nature and meaning that makes the experience of teaching itself. So, for example, when the authors say that the ontology of teaching is about love for the world, this love is not like meant to be only in a specific way. So, but it can also be in different ways. So let's say in different ontic expressions. There are different ways that teachers, they show their devotion for what they teach. And here they give, for example, they say that there are teachers that can express their love in a fervent way, others in an attentive way, and so on. Yeah, basically that's what I was saying, because I'm looking also at the book now. And then for them, such a definition of love, such definition of education, the most important thing for them in teaching education is that we don't look at those sociological, social, psychological, economic expressions and definitions of education. And that's not to say that what sociologists or doctors or parents or friends do is irrelevant in terms of education, but these are only ontic expressions. They are not ontological as the authors want to do. And to have an ontology of education, such phenomena, that, as I said, those, I don't know, for example, when a child shows their grandparents how to use a phone, when friends teach you something, I don't know, like how to use a laptop or so on, or when your parents tell you to wear this and not that, these are not really education. And to understand what education is and what teaching is, we need to, all these experiences need to be brought out. And we need to focus only about teaching as not related to all these social and political expressions. Again, the authors would say that the ontology of teaching refers to this affirmative and substantial account of what it means to be a teacher, and it's not. And that one of the reasons for that, one of the ways to do that, is actually to suspend any critical or politically or economically functionalist approach to teaching. And again, the role of the authors say that what they want to do with this book is not really to give like one definition of teaching, one definition of education, but on the other hand, they want really something to be useful for teachers and something that speaks to the experiences of teachers on their daily experiences, like as teachers with students. And from that, the book develops like its whole argument. And but like what's funny is that anyway the whole book is built from political ideas, even if the book says it doesn't want to be political. And anyway, and just to have an educational account of education that is not political. So, but then yeah, we have to be fair that the way that the authors use many references, they really try to do it in such a way to make a difference between teaching and politics. And why I always get back to the idea of politics and I don't talk, for example, about economics or biology and so on, because these are also for the authors something different from education. It is because the book itself and the movements of post-critical pedagogy that the authors are their leaders is something that came as an expression that's in dialogue more with critical pedagogy than with other fields, because they think that critical pedagogy is the most is the dominant, let's say, trend in thinking about education. So these whole ideas, as you will read from the introduction, they come basically from the reading of Hannah Arendt, her famous text, the text, what's the name, the Crisis of Education. And in the Crisis of Education, Arendt tries really to think of education